Access modifiers determine the level of access a class, method, or variable has. This determines if other classes or methods have the ability to use them. There are 4 access modifiers, starting from the most limiting, with the most limiting being private. The next is protected. Then we have public and global. Private means that the method or variable can only be accessed within the same class. Also, a top-level class cannot be private. Protected we will cover in a later lesson when we talk about virtual and abstract classes. Public means that the class, method, or variable is accessible throughout the same package. This is different than Java's public modifiers. Global means that the class, method, or variable is accessible by anything. I mainly use private and public, sometimes protected, and only use global if there is a specific need, such as an interface that requires that modifier. In this lesson, I'll be focusing on private and public. So first what we're going to do is we're going to create a class, an Apex class. I'm going to call it access modifiers. Then we're going to put it in the classes folder. Okay, and then I'm going to get rid of this with sharing. And then I'm going to remove the constructor that it automatically creates. And first what I want to do is I want to change this public to private. As we stated, this should not allow the ability for it to be deployed. So right now this is just in the local, so I can save it, but then when I try to deploy into the org, I should get an error, and I do. Top level type must be public or global visibility. So we'll change that right now to public. And now what we'll do is we will first create a private and public variable. So I'll create a public static string. I'll call it access mod string, and then the string will just be public string, and then I'll do a private static string, then access, I'll just call it mod str, and it will be private string. Will be this string, and then if I save that and then deploy that into the org. Now with the access modifiers, I should be able to now access the public, but when I try to access the private, since that should only be private, should only be able to be accessed within this class, we shouldn't be able to access it outside of. So if I go to here and I just type in, we'll do system.debug access modifiers access mod string, and then if I copy and do str, this would be the private one. So first I'm going to run the public. And when there it is. When I run that, I can see I debug public string. So this public string went through correctly, and we were able to access it outside of the access modifiers class. And then if I try to do the private one, access mod str, it says variable is not visible, access modifiers dot access mod str. So because it's private, we are not able to access it outside of this access modifiers class. So let's do the same with a method. I'll do a public static void, and we'll call it access mod pub method. So we got a public method, and this one will be really basic. We'll just do a debug, and then you were able to access the public method. And we will do the same with a private method. And then this would be a duplicate, so then I will just change the pub to PR, and then instead of public, we will call it private. And save, and then deploy again. Okay, and that went through. I'm just going to grab this for copying. So if I change, oh, I didn't copy correctly. So then if I call the method, and since this is a method and not a string or a variable, variables are called without a parentheses. Methods, you have to use the parentheses, and then if there's arguments, you put the arguments in as well. This one doesn't have any, so we're going to call it without any arguments. And then I'm going to grab the private method and then add parentheses as well, and then we're going to run the public method. Void debug. Oh, because they're void, they don't go in a debug because they are not returning anything. So then when I run that, I can see on the debug, you were able to access the public method. So that went through. And then if I try to do the private method, again, method is not visible. So now the next thing that we can do is the private methods are not able to be accessed outside of the class. However, they can be accessed within the class. So I could access the private method through the public method and call the public method. And same as with the, I can just debug and call get the variable, the private variable with it, which is access mod str. And then we can deploy. And this public method is able to then, since that's within the access modifiers class, it has the ability to access the private methods. So this is a way for us to be able to keep certain methods and variables to be only accessed within the class itself. The next thing that we can do, or the last thing that I want to show, is what if there is no access modifier on the next method. So I'm going to create a method, and we'll just call it static void. And so as you can see there, we aren't going to start with public or private, and I will call it access mod method, and we'll just have this one take in a string, and I'll call it param string, and then we'll just debug param string. Now I want to deploy, and we will deploy this. And then I want to grab this method, and we will call and delete this method. And then it takes a string, so we'll type in you were able to access mod method, and run. And we can see method is not visible, void access modifier access method. So because it didn't have a public or private access modifier, Salesforce automatically defaulted it as private. This can be very helpful to securing methods or variables within classes. And then also remember that the top level classes are not able to be private. So they have to be either public or global. Most of the time you'll just be using public. And then within the access modifiers is where you have a few other options as far as whether or not you want any of those variables or methods to be able to be used outside of this class. I almost forgot one thing, and this one is actually pretty important, and one of the reasons why private variables especially are very important and can lead to changes occurring that may not want to be changed if a variable is public. So as an example, with this access public method, what I'm going to do is I will add another debug, and this time we're going to debug the public method. And then I'm going to save and deploy the change. Okay, so now we have the public string as well within here. Now since this string is public and we can access it, we can also modify it. So that's where I wanted to show that if I were to take that public string and let's say public string has now been modified. And if I take the access modifiers and the public method and then run both of these together. So first we're going to get the public string, modify it, and then run this one, the public method. And instead of it being just public string, it should come out to be public string has now been modified. And if we take a look at the debug, it'd be the last debug because that was the one that we added with the string. We can see public string has now been modified because we modified the string and then we called that public method. So that's one thing to note and to be careful of when you do have public variables.